Yeah, absolutely. You can really tell the author has like a ton of seasoned expertise.
Oh, for sure.
But when an experienced professional writes this kind of material, acronyms and timeline metrics basically function as cognitive shorthand. Like mentioning an NDA or a BLA immediately triggers a mental map of a 5-year development strategy in the author's mind, you know?
Right, right.
But for a newcomer, regulatory affairs presents just an entirely foreign vocabulary. It really does. I mean, looking at the current draft, it reads less like an educational primer and more like a dense practitioner's reference manual.
Yeah, exactly.
The author fires off this rapid sequence of FDA device pathways. You got the INDs, NDAs, BLAs, 510Ks, de novos, PMAs, and then they just immediately pivot into rigid timeline metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Like the text compares the European Medicines Agency's 210 active days against 150 active days for accelerated assessment, and then contrasts that with the MHRA's 60-day versus 110-day recognition timetables.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. The student is just left trying to memorize what these acronyms stand for, completely missing the strategic implication of, say, why a PMA requires a fundamentally different evidentiary standard than a 510K.
Right, and that's the author's real challenge here, translating that reference manual back into an educational narrative. We really need to reframe these purely procedural lists into comparative real-world narratives.
Okay, yeah.
So my suggestion is to contextualize why these differences exist between distinct agencies evaluating similar evidence. That moves the student away from rote memorization and toward actual strategic comprehension.
So, giving them a reason to care about the numbers and letters?
Exactly.
Well, if we look at the section discussing the European Medicine Agency, the EMA, the author states that the EMA coordinates scientific assessment, but the European Commission grants the legally binding centralized authorization.
Right, which is accurate, but
But without context, right? A student likely interprets that distinction as mere bureaucratic red tape. So to bridge that gap, I think the author could implement an analogy, comparing the EMA's centralized authorization to a federal versus state governance model.
oh, I like that. Breaking down that governance model would really allow the author to clarify the underlying mechanism.
Yeah,
The text could explain that the EMA's scientific committees, like the CHMP, they act as a highly specialized federal advisory board, right?
right, exactly.
They consist of scientists, statisticians, clinicians who conduct the rigorous assessment of clinical trial data across all the European member states. They shoulder the whole burden of determining if the drug is scientifically safe and effective. Yet, they don't actually possess the authority to hand the sponsor a commercial license.
Right, and that's where the European Commission steps in as the executive federal body.
Yes.
They take that scientific recommendation and translate it into a legally binding authorization that applies across the entire European Union. It separates the scientific truth-seeking from the legal and political governance.
Which is such a crucial distinction.
Once you frame it like that, the students suddenly grasp that this isn't just arbitrary red tape, right? It's a deliberate architectural design to balance scientific rigor with sovereign legal authority across multiple nations.
Spot on. And you know, the author can apply a similar narrative strategy to the FDA device pathways too.
How so?
Well, instead of just presenting a static list of the 510K, de novo, and PMA options, the text could walk the student through a hypothetical product development scenario.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine a technology company has engineered a new wearable sensor designed to detect irregular heartbeats. We can illustrate how distinct agencies evaluate device evidence differently, based on the strategic pathway the company actually selects.
Oh, that's a great example. So the text could show the company initially analyzing the 510K pathway, which fundamentally asks the sponsor to prove the new sensor is substantially equivalent to a predicate device already legally marketed.
Right, the predicate is key there.
Yeah, and the author can explain that if a predicate exists, the pathway is inherently faster because the regulatory focus remains heavily on comparative engineering and bench testing.
Exactly. But the narrative tension emerges if, say, the company's sensor utilizes a completely novel, unproven AI algorithm.
Right, because then the engineering comparison fails.
Yes, the company lacks a valid predicate device, rendering the 510K pathway totally useless. And this is the optimal moment for the author to introduce the de novo pathway.
Ah, okay.
The text can explain that the de novo classification provides a route for a product that is entirely new and lacks a predicate, but still poses only a low to moderate risk to the patient.
That makes so much sense.
By walking the student through the company's internal regulatory debate, weighing the lack of a predicate against the actual risk profile of the device, those acronyms finally acquire strategic weight. The student internalizes why the pathway exists in the ecosystem.
They see it in action.
Exactly. Though I should note that employing narrative case studies like the wearable sensor or your federal governance analogy, those are just a few out of all possible ways to solve the jargon overload. But the principle of narrative contextualization is just critical for this audience.
For sure. But contextualizing the terminology is really only the first hurdle.
Right?
Once a student grasps the vocabulary, they must understand how to apply it chronologically to build a global strategy.
Which brings us to the structure.
Yes, transitioning abruptly from regional body descriptions to universal life cycle steps introduces a jarring shift in focus that disrupts the logical progression of submission strategy.
It really does, because currently the author structures the guide by detailing the specific agencies, the FDA, the EMA, the MHRA, and then jumps directly into broad universal concepts outlined as plan, assess, and maintain.
Right, with no real bridge.
Yeah, and the nuances detailing the differences between medical devices and pharmaceutical drugs are relegated to a completely separate, isolated section later in the manuscript.
Which is a huge missed opportunity. I mean, this disjointed structure dilutes the author's crucial underlying point about tailoring submission strategies.
Exactly.
The entire core of modern regulatory affairs is that a professional strategy fundamentally changes based on whether they are pushing a Class 3 device or a novel biologic through the pipeline.
It's night and day.
It is. By fracturing the product classifications away from the life cycle steps, the student loses the thread connecting who regulates the product to how they evaluate the distinct evidence.
Yeah, so the solution here is to restructure the flow to anchor the 5 steps to prepare a global regulatory submission directly to the product classification.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The text needs to demonstrate how the intrinsic nature of the product dictates the execution of those 5 universal steps. Instead of teaching the steps in a vacuum, the author should teach them in motion, right?
Teach them in motion. I like that phrasing.
Thanks. We can group the 5 submission steps: mapping requirements, assessing gaps, building dossiers, checking consistency, and planning responses around a comparative threat.
So, for example, the author could track a complex biologic, such as a monoclonal antibody, and run it side by side against the high-risk Class 3 medical device, like an implantable pacemaker.
Yes, perfect comparison.
When the text introduces the concept of mapping requirements, it should contrast the two products directly. For the biologic, mapping requirements across the FDA and EMA demands a heavy focus on controlling source materials, demonstrating process consistency, and mitigating immunogenicity risks.
Right, it's very science-heavy in that specific way.
Exactly. The regulatory professional must navigate pharmaceutical development and bioavailability guidelines.
But conversely, mapping requirements for the pacemaker looks entirely different. The regulatory focus shifts toward intended use statements, mechanical design history, electrical safety testing under ISO standards, and, rigorous software validation.
It's a completely different language.
It is! The regulatory bodies involved might be different, the engineering standards are completely distinct, and the required evidence is basically no overlap with the biologic.
And then when the text moves into assessing gaps, the author can highlight that for the monoclonal antibody, a gap assessment might reveal missing clinical endpoints in diverse patient populations, or maybe insufficient long-term efficacy data in human trials.
Right. Whereas for the pacemaker, assessing gaps might uncover failures in accelerated aging bench tests or insufficient sterilization validation.
Or a lack of biocompatibility data for the specific titanium alloy used in the implant?
Exactly. And as the guide progresses into building dossiers and checking consistency, the student needs to see that compiling a submission is not just a generic administrative task.
Right, it's not just filling out forms.
Not at all. For the biologic, building the dossier requires compiling the highly structured ECTD, the Electronic Common Technical Document. The author can explain its rigid XML format and universal module structure demanded by global health authorities for drugs.
But for the pacemaker?
Building the dossier involves constructing a technical file or a design dossier, which follows a completely different narrative structure and varies significantly between the US FDA and a European notified body.
Yeah. By running this dual drug versus device thread directly through the submission steps, the student learns the universal framework while simultaneously understanding that the execution of those steps is entirely bespoke to the product's classification.
Exactly. Anchoring abstract concepts to tangible products just reinforces the strategy so much better.
It makes it real.
Yeah. And I must emphasize that running dual device versus drug threads through the submission steps is just one of several structural methods the author could use to bridge this gap. But whatever method they choose, the text must ensure product classification is not divorced from the regulatory process.
Absolutely. Now, tailoring that submission strategy and navigating the agency review process is obviously incredibly demanding, but it only represents half the product's life cycle.
True, true. Securing the approval letter is not the finish line.
Not even close. It initiates a completely new phase of regulatory obligations. But the guide's current structure kind of leaves the student somewhat stranded in the post-market phase.
Yeah, it does feel a bit abrupt there.
The section detailing post-approval compliance successfully outlines the necessary tasks, but it misses the opportunity to emphasize the critical technical skills required to execute them effectively.
I completely agree. The text presents a solid, accurate list of 5 steps to maintain compliance, which includes monitoring safety, controlling changes, updating labeling, meeting deadlines, and preparing for inspections.
All very important, but then completely isolated in a different section called Building Practical Regulatory Affairs Knowledge, the author lists essential professional skills like regulatory intelligence, technical writing, cross-functional communication, and safety reporting.
Yeah, and the inherent weakness here is that a new student will not intuitively connect the abstract task of controlling changes to the actual technical skills required to manage post-approval safety updates in a real-world setting.
Right.
Telling a student to monitor safety, it sounds like a passive activity. It sounds like, I don't know, watching a dashboard.
Waiting for a red light to blink.
Exactly. But in reality, post-market safety monitoring is an aggressive, high-stakes, deeply cross-functional operation. The author should integrate the necessary technical skills directly into the life cycle and post-approval compliance steps so students understand how the job is performed, not just what the job entails.
Okay, wait, let me pause here and play devil's advocate for a second. I want to challenge the premise that simply merging a skills list into a task list solves the fundamental issue for the reader.
Oh, okay. Go for it.
If a newcomer reads a newly combined sentence that just says, use cross-functional communication to meet a 5-day FDA reporting deadline, that still sounds like corporate jargon to me. Doesn't telling a student they need cross-functional skills just hand them another abstract concept to memorize without actually showing them mechanics of the job?
Oh, that is such a valid critique of the suggestion itself. I love that pushback.
Right? Because it doesn't quite paint the picture.
You're right. Merely dropping the phrase cross-functional communication next to a deadline achieves basically nothing. To make the integration work, the author has to dramatize the timeline and break down the mechanics of the skill.
Right. So how would they do that?
Well, let's look at the material's point about strict FDA device reporting timelines. The text mentions that reportable events require 30-day reports and certain urgent cases are due within 5 workdays. The author needs to show what happens in those 120 hours to actually demonstrate the skill.
Oh, I see. So the text could detail the sequence of events.
Exactly.
Like on day 1, a hospital reports that the pacemaker malfunctioned. The regulatory team detects the signal.
Yes.
And by day 2, the regulatory professional is using their cross-functional communication skills not just to send emails, but to orchestrate a full internal investigation. They have to coordinate with the clinical team to assess the severe medical impact on the patient.
Exactly. You're painting the picture now. By day 3, the regulatory lead is physically on the floor with the manufacturing and quality teams investigating the specific lot number.
Trying to figure out if a defect occurred on the assembly line.
Right, or if it was a surgical error. They act as the central hub of intelligence, synthesizing complex engineering, manufacturing, and clinical data.
Wow.
And then, by day 5, they employ their safety reporting skills to translate that internal investigation into a formal, compliant, legally sound report to the FDA.
When the text breaks the timeline down mechanically like that, the student realizes that meeting a 5-day deadline is not about typing speed.
No, definitely not.
It is about mastering rapid, high-stakes coordination across multiple scientific disciplines. The abstract skill of cross-functional communication becomes a tangible survival tool.
That is perfectly said. And, the author can apply this exact same methodology to the task of updating labeling.
Yeah, because the material currently mentions technical writing in its isolated skills list.
Right. So the author could combine that directly with the labeling update task, explaining to the student that updating a label involves far more than fixing typographical errors or adjusting the formatting.
Right, the text needs to illustrate how precise technical writing operates as a mechanism of legal and scientific defense.
Yes, defense is the right word.
Because if a post-market clinical trial reveals a new minor side effect, the technical writer must draft the new label language with absolute precision.
They really do. They have to satisfy the regulator's demand for patient transparency without inadvertently using language that implies a wider systemic failure of the drug.
Exactly, because that could trigger an unnecessary global recall or shareholder panic.
Exactly. The skill of technical writing is literally the shield that protects the product's compliance status while maintaining public safety.
Integrating the skills directly into the tasks like that brings the theoretical framework down to the desk level, really showing the student what their Tuesday morning actually entails.
Yeah. And just as a reminder, weaving these specific skills directly into the post-approval task list is just one potential method for making the day-to-day realities of regulatory professionals clearer. But grounding the abstract skills in high-stakes scenarios is arguably the most valuable addition an educational guide can provide for a newcomer.
I completely agree. Well, to provide a highly concise recap of our 3 main critiques of the text today, first, we addressed audience alignment by suggesting the author decode dense procedural jargon through comparative real-world narratives, such as the federal governance analogy for the EMA.
Right.
Second, regarding structure and flow, we recommended structurally linking the product classification directly to the global submission steps, allowing the student to see how a biologic versus a device fundamentally alters the regulatory strategy.
Yep.
And third, for completeness and focus, we advised integrating essential technical skills directly into the post-approval compliance duties to show students the mechanics of how the work is actually executed under pressure.
Yeah, so I'd say the most actionable takeaways for the author to implement are building out comparative case studies for the FDA and EMA pathways, running a detailed side-by-side drug versus device comparison through the 5 submission steps, and formally merging the isolated technical skills list into the post-approval maintenance scenarios.
Excellent summary. We warmly invite you to revise your educational material based on this feedback and submit it back in for another critique. Transforming a dense reference manual into an engaging educational guide is a complex editorial challenge. But by contextualizing the vocabulary, aligning the structure with the product, and illustrating the practical skills in action, you will provide newcomers with the exact foundational map they need to succeed in this industry.